So here's an interesting question that gets posed often is, which is more difficult, a squat or a lunge, or what is the difference between the two? So squat and lunges are kind of interesting in a sense that they're really very much the same. So if I look at the joint actions that are happening during a squat, so we're going to look at the bottom screen, going to get triple flexion. So at the bottom of the squat, we have the ankle, knee, hip, all flexing simultaneously. And then we have triple extension coming up to the top, finishing in that nice long straight line. Now if we look at the lunge, we actually have the exact same thing going on. It's just happening a little bit differently. So as I look at the top screen, we're going to watch the ankle, knee, hip on that lead leg. And you notice as I drop down, we drop into flexion. Obviously it's not as much to the ankle. We're actually going to talk about that on a different day. And then same thing, I have that same amount of flexion in the back, and then as we drive up, it is extension. So the position's a little bit different because the legs are indifferent, but here's where they start to differentiate. So the mechanics in the legs are very, very similar. If I can work on good squatting and teach good triple flexion, good triple extension in all three of the lower body joints, then I can have happy, healthy lunges. But where the lunge becomes more challenging is actually in the trunk, in the middle. So when I do a squat, we're going to look at that bottom screen again. As I sit down, both of the femurs are doing the exact same thing. All right, so both femurs are pulling up towards the chest as I drop down into that pattern, which means there is almost no rotational force on the hips, whereas if I look at the lunge, it's very different. So I have my back leg is drawing and stepping backwards, and then my front leg is pushing forward. So now, just because of this, I have actually created a bit of rotation into the hips where it is pulling and pulling across here. So which means my trunk has to work considerably harder to stabilize that rotation. So and not to let this back hip draw backwards and open up and twist around that axis. So it takes a lot more core stability and able to do that movement properly. As I get down to the bottom of the lunge, what we're looking for here is a nice long line from the shoulder down to the knee, but what you see in a lot of people is that line actually gets a little bit more crooked, where it'll boom, 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 and then zag back out, where they keep this foot right here a little bit further forward, and that is a defense mechanism to not allow this hip to open, because they're lacking core stability to open that hip, because when that hip opens, it pulls back and they start to actually rotate around through the pelvis. So when we're looking at what is the big difference between squats and lunges, the joint action is very, very similar in the lower body. So once we can teach that on the squat, we're set up for a good lunge. But the added piece that we really need for good lunging is not only good mobility through the hips, but we need to have a great level of core stability to avoid that rotational force on the pelvis as we go through the range of motion.